Welcome to the Radical Centrist podcast. In 2016, a political economist and the director of the William R. Rhodes Center for International Economics and Finance within the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University predicted that Donald Trump would win the presidential election, despite the fact that nearly every poll and the broadly held belief of in political circles was that Clinton would win in a rout. That lone voice was the voice of Mark Blyth. At the time, economists and pundits both looked at Blyth's prediction as a humorous anecdote that they could toss into their various presentations about the upcoming election. They soon would be eating large quantities of crow. In the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump, Blyth was seen as prescient, and his theories that wove together economics and historic trends and precedents were suddenly highly sought after. To Blyth, the growing disparity of wealth was a potent driver in the growing divisions infecting the body politic and a systemic existential threat to our democracy. But Blyth had not only seen the danger ahead of us. As they say these days, he brought the receipts. In fact, the savage inequality of wealth that had developed in America in the years beginning in the mid-1970s, a topic that had only been an afterthought in the minds of policymakers and academics, was suddenly an alarming and potent driver in a crisis that suddenly was on nearly everyone's radar. Now, Blyth gives credit to Thomas Piketty for highlighting the problems of wealth disparity. But anyone who has read Piketty's Capital and then watched any one of 100 YouTube presentations by Blyth will see that Mark Blyth is the Carl Sagan of economics, making the topics that usually cause our eyes to glaze over understandable and approachable. Dare I say, even fun. In a few short years, Blyth has become one of the most important thought leaders, not only here in America, but internationally. His wry sense of humor makes him a much appreciated speaker. In fact, I've often said that he has a second career in stand-up comedy, should he ever decide to change course. He's also the kind of guy you'd want to have a beer with, or a glass of bourbon, or in my case, the kind of guy you'd want to jam with until late in the evening. But what makes Mark Blyth's findings and observations so much more powerful is that he weaves his findings into pragmatic and innovative ideas that bridge the divides between ideologies and strikes deep into the heart of the toxic tribalism that is infecting us. And he has broadened his message and research to encompass other critical problems, like the need to question our assumptions about austerity and the need to address the climate crisis. In short, Mark Blyth is, to my mind, a radical centrist, seeking innovative and practical solutions outside of the ideological bonds that too often separate us from one another. Mark Blyth often quotes John Maynard Keynes in his presentations when he says, "The problem is not a lack of new ideas. It is our inability to escape from the old ones." In fact, the Watson Center's website highlights this when they write of him. Mark Blyth is a political economist whose research focuses upon how uncertainty and randomness impact complex systems, particularly economic systems, and why people continue to believe stupid economic ideas despite buckets of evidence to the contrary. His most recent and, to my mind, most important book, written with his co-author Eric Lonergan, is Angrynomics. We spent a good deal of our time in this conversation on the book because I feel strongly that it is one of the most important books of the last decade on the subject of wealth disparity. It is also written in a fashion that makes their ideas easily understood and approachable. I'm grateful that he was willing to share his time with us. Here's my conversation with the one and only Mark Blyth. Can I call you Mark? Is that all right?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. I am going to fill this. I'll fill all this this podcast in at the beginning with all of your many titles and all that. But
Well, don't do that. Keep it short. That just bores people. It's like it's like you're listening to a funeral eulogy. Just keep it short.
Well, that's why I have to start by saying that I am speaking with a man that I admire intensely, Mark Blyth, who is a professor of political economics at Brown University, and has a part-time career, not a part-time, a full-time career awaiting for him if he ever decides to go into stand-up comedy.
that works perfectly.
Mark, let's start off with what exactly you see when you use the term political economist. I mean, I have listened to so many people representing various candidates and presidents, et cetera, who are basically use their economic knowledge to fulfill their job as a sycophant to the politician that they work for. But I've never heard that kind of stuff coming from you. So how do you define your field?
So there's kind of two ways that people in my game look at the world. The first one is through a lot of math. There's nothing wrong with that. You can get to the sort of the essence of things. It makes you see things in a very interesting way. It takes highly abstract things and makes them simpler, at least if you understand the math. And the other way to do it is really much more historical, to basically go and look at what real people did and try and understand why they made the choices that they did. And that's basically where kind of like a political economy approach differs from a more traditional economic approach. So if I want to explain something like why it is that center-left governments keep promising never to spend any money when the only thing that they could ever do is spend money, why would you want to make that promise? I look back to history. I look back to what happened to them. I look to why the leaders in a certain moment thought that they needed to do certain things. So essentially, it's a much more inductive, much more historical way of looking at the world.
Okay. Well, so you tend to take a very pragmatic approach to current affairs, and your most recent, I think your most recent book, Angrynomics, which I want to say is one of the most important books written in the last 5 years, and I urge people to pick it up and read it, or even better, from my point of view, listen to it so they can actually hear you in your own voice. And you take a very interesting approach to making this very accessible to people who are not economists and whose eyes tend to glaze over when they're told they're listening to an economist.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't have to be dry and boring. I mean, people are essentially very interested in this stuff because ultimately it affects them. Let me give you a start, right? This will just blow your mind. The following is true as far as we can figure it out from the data. So there's no angle on this. There's an organization called the Rand Institute. They were set up in the 1950s as a kind of defense think tank. They were probably more on the right to the center, certainly never been regarded as particularly left wing. They produced a paper in 2020 or 2021. It's got the rather anodyne title, Trends in Income 1979 to 2020. Trends in Income and Wealth, I think it is. You can find it on the internet very easily. And here's what it basically says. Imagine if you'd just taken 1980 and you looked at all the way that we had taxes set up and all the way that we had, regulation set up, and you look at the way that basically people's incomes were set, etc. And you just ran history forward, but you didn't change anything. You didn't do the big tax cuts in the 1980s. You didn't do the big defense expenditures, etc., that you had. You just kind of ran the model through in a steady state. What's the outcome? The two things. Your average American would have been $15,000 a year better off than they are now. And as for all the arguments about things trickling down when you give the rich all the money, they vacuum up to the tune of $34 trillion over a 40-year period. So if people don't find that arresting, if people don't find that kind of WTF, then, you're probably not paying attention, or you've got a very happy life, right? This stuff's going on all around us, and we know that there's something deeply wrong. We know it by the fact that, in principle, our society's never been richer, but at the same time, it doesn't seem to have ever been angrier with each other. And that's what we tried to get at in the book, like what's going on with that. And to us, a large part of it is basically economic, in the sense that an increasingly small amount of people have vacuumed up all the rewards and kept them to themselves, and have then spent a lot of that money in politics setting everyone else against each other.
Right. And so talk about the sort of the thematic approach of the book and the dialogue between the two of you and your co-author.
So it's set up as a dialogue, which is pretty unusual. It kind of limited us with publishers, because they were like, "You're not really going to do a dialogue, are you?" And we did, because the way that we set up the book was, Eric, my co-author, is a finance guy in London, and he's super busy, etc. So what we did was, we decided that we're going to do kind of like a joint reading list, stuff that we thought was important on technology, on anger, on economics, right? And then we got together, and we actually bought a couple of new iPhones back in 2018, I think it was. And we just pressed record and we talked it. So I then got somebody to turn the whole thing into a proper transcript, and we read it, and it was awful, because it just sounded like two smart guys being very smart and telling the world how clever they are. And it was boring. So we put it back into the dialogue and then kind of worked on it a bit more. And we actually got to something that was shorter, punchier, and much more like what we sound like and what we believe. And that's why we did the audiobook ourselves. You can do the whole audiobook in, I think, about 5 hours or something. It's actually me and Eric doing it. Now, that was the setup for doing it. And when you're in a dialogue, it allows you to disagree. It allows you to sort of take the conversation in different directions. So the next thing we did is we started on the whole notion of anger. And why are we all so damn angry just now? And we made an observation when we went to a soccer match in the UK, and it was a really crap soccer match, right? It was the Watford versus Everton or something. It was bloody awful. And we were right amongst the Watford ultras, the really hardcore fans. And if you notice what really hardcore fans do, they don't spend that much time shouting at the other team or shouting at the referee. They're actually shouting at their own fans. They're actually for not being loyal enough, for not being like in the game, like get in there and do the whole thing, right? And that kind of gave us a really interesting clue into thinking about politics. Because in a world in which, the old ideologies of left and right and all social justice or whatever just don't motivate most people, it pisses them off more than anything else, that you need something new. Nationalism tends to be one of those things, but just basically anger. Anger is a motivating force, making people angry, right? Just spend time on cable news. Just listen to AM radio. That's what it is. We're just being angry all the time, keeping everybody up. Everything is an existential threat all the time. Like, it's amazing that we aren't all just dead from stress, just from listening to this. And then we started to think about, well, what types of anger are out there? And it was interesting because, of course, we're publishing this book right in the middle of 2020. So you've got a pandemic, right? And then you got the whole Rodney King, sorry, not Rodney King, the 2020 race, and George Floyd, etc. Yep. George Floyd, right? And Rodney King, that was from way back. George Floyd, etc. And then, of course, it ends up with January 6th, right? And these are all sort of just different expressions of sort of anger and frustration, etc. So we've been trying to make sense of that. And what we came down on is, right, not making a moral judgment that these are good people or these are bad people. That essentially what motivates people is a sense of injustice in a particular way, that they have been wronged, that there's something has been done to them by a group that is not them, and that they are being systematically abused, excluded, whatever it happens to be. And, you can tell different versions of that story. I mean, the sort of the MAGA Republicans have a story about that, which led to January the 6th. The racial protesters have a story of that, leads to that. And again, we're not making moral equivalences. What we got into was the fact that anger in these situations becomes such a powerful motivating force. So that was the anger part of it. And then the second part of it, well, what's behind the anger? And essentially we were like, well, big economic screw ups when loads of people are harmed, that'll do it. So, here, I'll give you an example, not from the book, but from just now for people to think about. So think about, you got an election coming up in 2024. And if you look at opinion polls, we've never been more divided in the elections. They're going to be incredibly close, and there's going to be all this sort of manipulation and anger and everything associated with it. Let's try and figure out what's behind all this. So if you go back to 1971, 1 in 3 jobs were in the auto industry. 1 in 5 jobs, I should say. 1 in 3 jobs were in basically steel and the other things that went into the auto industry. The most prosperous part of the country was the Midwest, right? The highest wages were in places like Indiana and Indianapolis, way more than New York if you were a skilled manual worker. Then what happens is you start to get the move of industry south to avoid unions. And then from there, you get the birth of the container ship, the IT revolution, and you can start to do outsourcing. And after about 20 years, basically, we just empty out the Midwest. Then you bring globalization into it, and you bring China online, and you get the China shock to this sort of thing. And what you do is you basically destroy the Midwest. So that massive shock reverberates. That's why the most volatile part of the country in terms of politics, with the democratic lock that broke when Trump came through, etc., is the people that, in a sense, have been hit the hardest economically. Now, let's think about what's going on now. The politics of the moment is all about the green transition, decarbonization. The Biden administration have got this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act. It gives huge subsidies to green industry, and there's lots of investments going into it, and it's all good. It's fine. Except the following. If you think about the way America works, the different business models, you've got, on the West Coast, you've got movies, and you've got software, and you've got tech. In the East Coast, you've got finance, insurance, real estate, government, etc. The Midwest got blown out. The only other functional part of the country in terms of having a positive business model starts in Alaska, goes down through the Dakotas, Oklahoma, Kansas, East Texas, basically through Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, ends up in West Virginia. They're all the reddest states in the union. And what is it they do for a living? 2 things, fuel and farms. And they're both super carbon intensive. So what does the IRA mean to North Dakota? It means no more fracking. What does it mean for Alaska? It means no more oil. So in other words, from their point of view, we're about to do to them what we did to the Midwest 25 years ago. And there's no way they're going to stand for it. Now, that might be going some way to explaining why people are so angry, why they're getting bent out of shape about the right to have a gas cooker, why you'll take my Ford F-150 from my cold, dead hands. Because it's not just about the objects themselves, it's about the ways of life and the ways of being that they allow. And that's what we're fighting about fundamentally, but we seldom realize it. And that is a political economy explanation.
And so people like Donald Trump or Jim Jordan, those people are really the symptoms of the problems. They're not the
Exactly.
cause of the problems.
Exact. That's a nice way of putting it, Wayne. That's exactly right. They're the kind of effervescent bubbles on the sort of the on the glass of spoiled bourbon, shall we say? That's a weird metaphor, a weird metaphor, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I got you. So you differentiate between sort of these two different forms of anger and how they can be recognized and also how they can be utilized to some
Hmm.
extent.
Exactly. So we talk about public anger and that sort of outrage, et cetera, et cetera. And we spoke about that, right? That's what motivates a lot of politics these days. But the other one, the sort of the reciprocal, the flip side of that is what we call private anger. And private anger, we think about shame and things like this, but these days it goes deeper. Something else that's happened to us over the past 30 years is that loads of things that used to be taken care of by external agencies, right? Whether it's your pension, whether it's your health care, whether it's education, has increasingly just been thrown onto the individual. And if you have tons of money, you can afford to do that. But if you don't, like most people have tons of money, if you adjust for inflation, the bottom 60% of the income distribution in the US has had stagnant wages, apart from the very recent past for like nearly 40 years. That's that big
Hmm.
vacuuming up of
Hmm.
all the cash, right? So it's becoming tougher and tougher at the bottom. And then you think of the way the rules get written now, like non-compete clauses. Like you work for Jimmy John's, you can't go work for McDonald's. It's like, what's this all about, right?
Right.
That's not a tech worker with trade secrets. You think about the fact that fewer and fewer employers are offering healthcare. You got to do more out of pocket expenses. And then you think about the fact that the people at the top don't really talk about this stuff. They like to just nudge you into better ways of behaving, right? Make sure that you have to opt in rather than opt out. And people are just feeling increasingly put upon, isolated, and in a different way, angry about the fact that all the stresses of life are put onto them, but all the benefits seem to be going somewhere else. And that gets played out in different ways, different forms of anger against immigrants, anger against people who are sexually different. And these, again, are mainly displacements. This isn't really what the cause is. These are the symptoms, but they're increasingly common in the fever of the body politic.
And they contribute to this sense of tribalism that has infected politics completely.
Exactly. And, we use the word tribalism throughout the book because it is essentially that. And that goes back to those football players, right? Or rather, football fans. Are you on the team or not? And if you're not on the team, you're suspect, right? These people are the ones that like get really angry. You're real activists, whether it's on the left or it's on the right. And they, particularly in a primary led system, increasingly run politics, which means that the politicians have to be more and more extreme just to be credible with their own base. So there's a
Yeah.
massive gap of representation. It's driven by anger. There's really good material reasons why people have every right to be pissed off and demand redress on multiple levels. But the political system is set up in such a way to amplify this rather than to calm it.
Right. So that sort of gets us to the whole theme of this uh, series that we're doing on the radical centrists called uh, rediscovering our song, which is to say, how do we begin to heal the divisions that have developed over the last 50 years? And I think the you and Eric Lonergan have some just extraordinary ideas, and I'd like to have you talk about some of them. But talk about it, I think, in the context of why it is that you began thinking about these things as a means of healing some of these divides.
So if you remember back in 2020 when all the sort of the racial awakening happened, and there was and then also prior to that when Trump was elected, there were two strands of opinion. And the first one was this is the long run costs of massive economic inequality, punching people in the face for 30 years and eventually it finds an outlet, which I subscribe to.
Yeah.
The other one was everyone's just a racist. And the problem with the everyone's just a racist thing, there's lots of problems, but one of them is particularly in the American context, If you look on a county by county level at the results of 2016, the majority of people that went for Trump in the 5 states that mattered, really just 4 states, had previously voted for Obama twice.
Right.
So you can't. Every night everyone just suddenly became racist. This doesn't make any sense to me, right? So if you go with that, the good thing is when you have an economic problem, there are economic solutions. If the problem is you live in a town where no businesses grow, you live in a place where the town is collapsing, the rents are still expensive, there's limited opportunities, everyone works at the dollar store or the Walmart, and that's large chunks of the US, then yeah, things aren't that great. Well, that's an economic problem, that's a distributional problem, it's an opportunities problem. You can, in principle, do something about that. If it's basically the fact that everyone's now racist, there's not much you can do there apart from have a giant war. So, I stick with the economic one mainly because there are at least things you can do. Now, we can talk about, the things that you can do, but I mean, really what it is about is just leveling the opportunity field. Right? I'll give you an example of this. I teach at Brown University. It's a very, very fancy Ivy League university. Now, on the one hand, we do pretty good when it comes to redistribution. Giving options, giving opportunities, and we're quite conscious of this. We actively seek out first-generation students, etc. But it's also true that we don't actually attract that many of those students because they're just so disconnected from it. If you look at the distribution across the Ivies, what you tend to find is there's more people from the top 1% showing up than there are from the bottom 60%. Now, this has always been the case, but these days, because of the costs associated with it, etc., it seems as if almost we live in a very different world. People feel disconnected from this, as if we're almost a type of different species living on a different planet. And the ability to sort of, address that as a problem, to make the claim that we are actually meritocratic institutions interested in lifting everybody up into a credible claim for them, that's one area you could start in.
So one of the things that really I'm drawn to is the very pragmatic approach that you take to making suggestions for practical ways that we could address, particularly the disparity of income that exists in the country, and none of which involve directly just raising taxes,
right?
Which is a giant red flag that helps to create these divisions between people.
Which, in a sense, is a tragedy because the crazy thing about the tax structure of the United States is the United States, in comparison to most other rich countries, actually is comparatively lightly taxed. I mean, most people have an effective tax rate of less than 30%. You try anywhere in Europe, you won't even get close to that. And yet we go up in arms about our tax burden. The reason that we have a tax burden, and we should worry about it, and we have deficits, etc., is we spend more than we tax. Now, the Republican solution of that is spend less. But unless you're willing to really tackle the big ticket items and say, no, you're not getting Medicare, and no, you're not getting Social Security, and no, we're not going to spend on the military, there just isn't enough to cut, right? So why is it we don't have enough revenues? We don't have enough revenues because corporations pay no taxes. And you hear these headline figures about corporation tax, like Trump cut it from 35 to 21%. When it was 35%, the real effective rate of corporations or domestically based was around 6 to 12. For companies that have international operations, it was 0. I'm talking Apple, Google, etc., right? They pay no taxes. Every single year, I personally pay more taxes than General Electric. Like, just think about that for a minute, right? They get representation in courts. They're treated as legal objects, all the rest of it. They have the rights, all the rest of it. And guess what? They pay no taxes whatsoever. So there is a tax side to this, right? We didn't talk about it that much in the book, but people should be aware of the fact that the reason they're so put on for taxes is because corporations stopped paying taxes effectively around 1985. So there's one thing. Other stuff, though, non-tax, one of the big ideas that we're fond of is the idea of taking a sovereign wealth fund and turning it into a citizens' wealth fund. Now, what does that mean? So a lot of countries around the world, particularly the ones that are oil exporters, earn lots and lots of dollars. The problem with that is they don't have dollars in their own banking systems. They have different currencies. So then they have to turn that into the domestic currency. And if they put too much out, then they'll have inflation. So they end up kind of hoarding it. What do they do with the hoarding? Well, you can turn it into treasury bills if you want. That gives you 2% and some, it's a safe asset. But you could also buy equities. You could buy shares, right? So if you're somewhere like Abu Dhabi or Norway, you own like 0.25% of everything in the world. You have this huge distributed portfolio, and that earns you loads of money, and that's a nice thing, and that's why Norway is incredibly rich and so on and so forth. So how can we do that? Because even though we're an oil exporter, it's not as if we've just discovered oil, right? What's the trick? Well, what we figured out was the following. You know how there keep being these financial crises, and the Fed has to step in all the time and buy assets? Well, every time there's a financial crisis is essentially when so-called liquidity runs out. And what does that actually mean? It means you can't find someone to buy the thing you want to sell. And why do you want to sell? Because the shit's hit the fan and you need some cash. And everybody's in the same position and everybody wants to sell and nobody wants to buy at a price that you're willing to pay. So basically there's a gap in the market. That's what we call a credit crunch, and that's when bad things happen. So the Fed steps in at that point. Why? Because people are trying to get out. So they're selling good stuff to cover their bad losses. That's why equity markets, the stock markets, regularly fall 40 to 50% in the initial period of a crisis. And then what happens is the central bank comes in and just, hang on, lads, I'll take care of this. I'll buy all this stuff. Well, they buy all this stuff. In the financial crisis, it was mortgages. In the COVID crisis, it was ETFs and actual equities and companies and stuff. And our argument is the following. What do they do with it after they've bought it? Well, they wait till the market recovers and then they basically give it back to the people that had sold it in the first place, oftentimes at a discount. And we're like, well, no, how about the following? How about we just build a sort of Abu Dhabi or a Norway out of this? We just keep all those equities. We're not after control. We don't want control of the companies or whatever. But when those markets recover, that's a 40 to 50% gain. And if they continue to grow after that, you've got a huge return. Now, you say, well, how would you buy all those equities? That's going to cost the government lots of money. Well, the interesting thing is when stock markets go down, bond markets go up. And what does that mean? It means that the price of a bond goes up because everybody wants to buy them. They're in short supply. That's a safe asset. You want out of equities, which is risk. You want to buy safety, which is bonds. And the weird thing about bonds is that their prices and the interest rate in the bond vary inversely. Why is that? Because the more demand for it is, the more price goes up, the more the yield you have to offer to sell the damn thing goes down. In a crisis, the yield goes negative. In other words, investors are paying you to take the debt on. So if you issued 20% of GDP at a negative yield, bought all those equities, and then the equities come back, that's literally free money. If you did this with 20% of GDP on the size of the US economy over a 10-year period, you can make $6 to $8 trillion. Now, if a large part of our malcontent is caused by the fact that everybody's 15 grand a year poorer than they should be, or, for example, you don't have enough money to invest in skills, you don't have enough to invest in schools, you don't have enough to do the various things you want to do that would actually improve people's quality of life, that'd help, and you haven't had to raise any taxes to do it. So, that's one thing that could be done, and there's various other stuff that we talk about in the book. But, the key thing is there are solutions. It's not just all despair all the way down.
Now, another idea that you have is a data dividend. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and many people have pointed out that this wouldn't actually raise that much money, but the point of it is not really to raise the money. It's more sort of like a property rights claim, and that gives people a stake in the economy. So think about this: if you think about Google, you think about Facebook. You are the product. Literally, your keystrokes into their platform give them the data, which they then clean up and then optimize and sell as advertising or do various things with, right? So you're the product. Now, in a sense, that's kind of like licensing a technology. It's almost like you're the intellectual property and you're giving it away for free. So it's the old Silicon Valley thing, as if the product is free, you're the product. Now, if we were to take a parallel case of this, like mobile phones, think about mobile phones. Every time that there's a new band that's been opened up, whether it's 3G, 4G, 5G, a different bit of the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, is basically auctioned off by the government. And these companies basically bid to get a chunk of that, and that's where they're going to run their networks. So why don't we do that with the internet? Why not basically give these big companies, if you will, the right to harness data? People can opt in or opt out of a national data trust, and then we can sell that to these companies on a limited basis. That would give us much, much more data protection, but it would also give everybody a direct stake, if you will, in the digital economy. Because if you're going to be the product, you might as well get some of the reward back from it. Now, even if this doesn't actually raise that much money, like average revenue per user of Facebook is actually quite low. It's not that much in terms of like raising revenue. What it does is it changes the power relationship between, if you will, the customers and the company themselves. Because when you are the product, but you have property rights associated with it, you can stop a lot of the stuff that companies have been doing, which they've been getting into trouble for, and which are serious threats to both sort of privacy, democracy, etc., etc. So that's another way of kind of like bringing leverage to bear without ever tampering with free speech directly or whatever, but nonetheless having a sort of a way into the digital economy, particularly into the sort of the social media space, which would basically give companies an incentive to behave better with people's data because they would have a property rights claim to it.
Now, I'm often reminded of a presentation that I saw with Yanis Varoufakis, where he held up an iPhone and he went through all of the apps on his first page, and he said, these companies all got rich from the research that was funded by taxpayer dollars.
Yeah. It's his point, but it's also the person who really did the work on this is Mariana Mazzucato, and she points out that, like, I've got an iPhone here, right? I can tell you what all those technologies. It's not the apps, forget the apps, right? It's the underlying technologies, right?
Right.
So the touchscreen, right? That's Lodestar. That was the U.S. Air Force, right? GPS for your maps. That's the U.S. Navy, so they know where they are in the ocean. Right. TCP/IP, the internet protocol, that was DARPA to survive a nuclear electromagnetic explosion. The chipset for the video was DARPA. The microphone technology, I think, was also DARPA. There's a whole list. Basically, everything in this was done by the kind of defense industrial state. And that was funded by taxpayer dollars. Now, two questions. Why are taxpayers not getting the upside?
That's
well,
right.
because we didn't license it. What we did is we make these technologies, and when we decide that they're not sensitive, we just give them out to the private sector, and then the private sector puts them in boxes, and then we all go buy them. That's a fine business model. It's what's made Apple one of those profitable companies in the world. But if you think about it from the point of view of, well, who was the initial investor? Well, then there's a different story you could tell.
Mm-hmm. And that could be in addition to what you've just talked about with the data dividend, that could be another tool in our arsenal for creating ways to provide basically a dividend to Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. So to me, it's more about sort of what we've done over the past 40 years is to vilify, demonize, and kneecap the state and turn it into something that people think's horrible. And in some ways it can be, there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, every time there's a crisis, who do you go running to? You don't go running to Elon Musk, you go running to the state. So as we live in a world which is more sort of vulnerable to climate shocks, etc., that, think about Texas, like 100 days a year now over 100 degrees. It's only going to get hotter, right? What's the stress that's going to put on their electric grid? Everybody uses more air conditioning. You're just going to need more electricity. You can see how this is just a problem. And when it breaks, whenever there's a disaster or whatever, everyone's like, where's the government? It's like, well, you've just spent 40 years shitting on it. So why do you expect it to be here, right? And to me, sort of part of this is like rebuilding trust in the state and then rebuilding capacity in the state so that we can do things that help each other, right? It's a right. Kind of like, if you just give it up to the market, the people who own the market get all the benefits. Right? Think about housing, right? Why is housing so expensive? Because we basically stopped building housing for normal people back in the 1980s. Now, if you're building in any major city, you're lucky if you get half a dozen affordable units stuck on your luxury condos, because that's where all the money is. If you leave things to the market will go where the profit is. The reason that we have states is because we need to build things where there's no profit.
But it seems to me that much of what you are advocating for in this book is ways that we can insert the people of the country into that market so that they have a stake.
Yeah, absolutely. Giving them a stake back into it rather than feeling excluded from it. That's entirely it. Where I'm a little bit skeptical is I've never been convinced by the sort of universal basic income arguments, right? The reason being that when you say to someone, here's a UBI payment, here's a subsidy, here's a handout, right? There's a particular cadence in the United States. I've lived here for 30 years. I fully get it. That people's identities are bound up with their employment. Their sense of self-worth is tied up with their employment. If you basically say to people, we don't really need you anymore. We've got robots and AI, but, we'll give you like 15 grand to just, bugger off and not be annoying. That's terrible. You're saying to people, you're redundant. We don't need you. You're not wanted in this society. And if you think about the fact that we have an aging society going forward, we need all the help we can get, right? Whether it's elder care, whether it's health care, whether it's, bringing younger people in the workforce because we have less of them. We've got huge areas where we need people to work. So what we really need to do, I think, is not to think about a world without work and paying people off because, people find their partners at work, they get fun at work, they find their friends at work. You take all that away from people and just give them a handout. I don't think it goes into a very good place.
But if you define it as a handout,
which will be done. That's the thing. That's the way it will be played. We remember this from 72, right? We're both old enough to remember this. Remember what it was called with McGovern? The demo grant. Mm-hmm. Right? We've been here before. We had this in 1978 with exactly the same conversation over whether the federal government should give a job guarantee. Right. But the thing is, we have 3.4% unemployment and we're trying to cause a recession and we seem to be unable to do so. Wages are actually rising for a change for ordinary people. What's the problem we're trying to solve here for? I don't think the problem is employment. I think the problem is the fact that our politics are horribly polarized.
Right. But now I have to tell you, you're talking to an Iroquois boy here, so when I hear people talking about reparations, for example, I basically feel like, step behind my folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then I know when I think about it that that's just going to cause greater division in the country. And we've got to find ways that we unify people instead of setting them against one another for those benefits. But you don't seem to think that we can win the argument that as an American citizen, people are paying their taxes and they are then entitled to receive some of the benefits of the growth that we create.
I think I totally defend that claim. It's not that I don't think that. It's just that let's imagine that we built the sovereign wealth fund. There's another big crisis over a 10-year period. We make a couple of $1 trillion. What should you do with that? If you just cut it as checks and give it to people, that'd be an interesting experiment, right? Because what would happen if you gave everybody in America under, let's say, $100,000 a year, a $20,000 check? For some people, it would transform their lives. You'd be able to pay off your debts. You'd be able to start a business. You'd do this sort of stuff. Other people would just buy Bitcoin, right? With total waste, right? And you're taking a chance when you do that. If, on the other hand, you say, okay, so we've got this, what can we do? Well, how about we just wipe out all student debt and then also medical debt? How about we just take people out from under those burners? You don't basically bankrupt the creditors. You just pay that off on a one-time gig. That changes people's lives as well. So it's a question of what you do with the wealth that you generate. Right. And, simply giving it out to people, I think, is very politically vulnerable, even if it may lead to good outcomes, because people are going to politicize it and say, you didn't work for that. You did not work for that. That is a handout. That's incredibly vulnerable in this society.
Right. But to at least have that discussion in a positive way would be a huge step forward.
Absolutely. But with the level of anger we've got, I mean, I saw something the other day. It's an incredible set of statistics, and it was a latest YouGov poll on what causes inflation, and it was cut by basically Democrats and Republicans, right? You know what Republicans think causes inflation?
What?
Democrats. Like literally the number one thing that causes inflation is the existence of Democrats, right?
Right.
Now, that's kind of funny. It's also kind of terrifying, right?
Yeah.
The next thing that causes it, of course, is Joe Biden, right? So,
Right.
Ukraine war, supply chain shocks, all the stuff that actually causes inflation. We don't want to think about that. We just want to blame the enemy, right?
Mhm.
That's how bad it is.
Are we? I haven't gone into any discussion about various economic models, but I've listened to quite a bit of information about modern monetary theory, and I know you're somewhat of a skeptic of that. But have we gotten ourselves into this situation where basically the two parties are quietly modern monetary theory folks when they're in power, and then when the other guy is, they
Yeah,
don't
then they
want
become fiscal hawks, right? No,
right,
I
right,
think you're absolutely onto something there. Look, the thing about it is the United States is unique because it prints the global savings asset. And there's too many people in the world that make too much stuff and they can't buy it themselves. So they have to sell it to us. And that means they have to hold dollars, whether they like it or not. In those circumstances, you functionally run the equivalent of kind of like a giant closed economy model. Can the United States do MMT? Does it do MMT? Well, look what happened in the pandemic, right? Suddenly we magicked up trillions of dollars, mailed it out to people. And the MMT argument is, well, you stop when you get inflation. Well, now we have inflation, we stop. So to a certain extent, it's shown that, yes, you can do that. Where I'm skeptical is when you get smaller open economies that are really dependent on imports and exports and stuff like that and the value of their exchange. Then when you start to spend, people don't have to hold your currency. They can swap it for something else. Then your exchange rate goes down. Then your imports cost more and you can get into trouble really, really quickly. So I'm not sort of someone who blanket dismisses. I think that they've done a great service clarifying things for people like, for example, the public debt is the private sector savings, right? When
right.
you wipe out half the national debt, you wipe out half the private sector savings. So it's been very, very, salutary in that way. I think that the COVID pandemic, in a way, and I'm really surprised the MMT people aren't making more of this, kind of proved their point. They're like, we can magic up trillions if we need. And at the end of the day, the cost that we pay for this is basically inflation. I mean, we're running an MMT experiment just now, at least for the United States. Now, the United States is able to absorb those costs, but look at Britain. Britain's basically in danger of having very high inflation, incredibly low growth, and ended up in a really bad situation going forward. So, these are not universal panaceas, shall we say.
What to what do you attribute the bulk of the inflation that we've seen after 20 years of virtually no inflation?
Yeah.
We suddenly have a big pop at the end of the COVID
So
crisis.
I think it depends on whether you think that it's caused by quote unquote real or monetary factors. And most economists will say, as Milton Friedman did, that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. And I like the line that the Fed has about this graffitied on a wall somewhere that says, shootings are always and everywhere a ballistic phenomena. Yes, bullets are involved, but it doesn't tell you much about who was shooting whom or why, right? So on the sort of there's a different way of looking at it is let's tell a story in the 1970s. So the 1970s story goes something like this. We kept spending money. There was over full employment. Eventually you couldn't keep up real wage growth without basically just stoking the fires of inflation. There was a couple of supply shocks with oil that added to this. Eventually inflationary expectations got out of control. Paul Volcker had to come along and jack up interest rates and cause a massive recession, and then we squeezed it out of the system. Story one. Here's story two. Back in the late 1960s, you incorporated an absolute ton of women and minorities in the labour market. Usually that would reduce the price of labour because there's more of them going in. But with so many people fighting in Southeast Asia and so much government spending that was new spending, we got the Great Society programs, the war on poverty, etc., building out educational institutions. It just didn't have that deflationary effect. In fact, it kind of just added to demand because more people were spending. Mm-hmm. Then there was two failed harvests. People forget about this. One in the Soviet Union, one in Canada and the United States. It put wheat prices and grain prices up. Then there was the oil shock that quadrupled oil prices. Then there was another oil shock in 1979. Each of these things is going to basically cause shortages, which then pushes up prices. Each of them decays over time, but because they all came one after another, it basically pushed inflation up. What was happening was inflation was already falling if it hadn't been for the 1979 shock on oil prices. And when Volcker came in, if he didn't jack up interest rates, chances are it would have got a kind of painless deflation. Now, what is it that we're seeing now? You've had COVID, where you had a very big stimulus in terms of monetary stimulus. But in terms of the checks causing the problem, ask people, just go look at the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances for 2021. I think it's the middle of 21. The largest ever reduction in credit card receivables, i.e. credit card debt, occurred in the 2 quarters after the stimulus checks went out. People paid down their debts. That is inherently not stimulatory. So what was causing it? For the United States, has been a very consumption-driven economy, basically having a hit to consumption and having no supply chain problems. Then telling everyone to stay at home, where they all went and bought consumer goods, and Amazon's value went through the roof. And you had supply chain screw-ups and shortages, and all the stuff is in the wrong warehouse at the wrong time, and all the rest of it. And then you have the Ukraine war, and the Ukraine war is important because it pushes up global natural gas prices. Now, we're natural gas exporters. Why does that matter to us? Because we're now supplying Europe with tons of natural gas because they're no longer getting it from Russia, which means that the baseline price has been going up. And given the fact that we are actually a very energy intensive economy, that's going to hurt. So again, these are all real factors. Now they will dissipate over time. As you can see, because the United States doesn't have the energy problem, the energy input problem that Britain does, our inflation rate is now about 4%. The Brits are around 9%, right? So these are all different factors. But for me, it's about real shocks in the economy to which money adjusts and it shows up as higher prices. So that's basically how I look at it.
You often quote, I think it's Keynes, when you say the problem is not a lack of new ideas, it's our ability to escape from the old ones.
Yep, I think that's right.
And what do you see as the sort of the old ideas that are the most persistent and preventing us from moving on?
One of them, and again, hat tip to the MMT people here, because I think they're quite right about this, is the notion that basically we can't spend more than we earn, and the notion that the government's budget and the country's budget is just like a household budget. It's complete nonsense. There's no such thing as Mark Blyth dollars. If I issued them, you would never accept them as payment. I can't give you intragenerational Mark Blyth debt because I'm a finite person. In principle, the country is not. The country can credibly give you a 30-year bond as guaranteed by the incomes and growth of the economy. I can't do that, right? So I can write those things. I can bring new taxpayers into the family by through immigration or through NATO policy. I can grow my assets, right? You can't do any of that in a household to any near the same extent. So it's completely different. So the household analogy thing's kind of like very damaging. The other one is the notion that particularly affects like Democrats or the Labour Party in Britain or other people is we have to basically pledge all the time that we're never going to spend any money. And the problem with doing that is you piss off your own hardcore base because they actually want you to spend some money and you lose your base. But at the same time, you don't really gain on the other side because you might convince a few people who don't share your redistributionary ambitions to vote for you in this one election, but you don't get to keep them. So you're constantly having to bid up more and more. So this is like the Nancy Pelosi pay-go stuff, right? You only get to spend money if you take it away from something else. It's like, this is totally insane. You don't need to do this. When the United States wants to build an aircraft carrier, are we going around taking the money from something else? No, we just build an aircraft carrier, right? So, we talk about it in this way that we're under these terrible constraints. And it's like, well, just look over there, for example, the defense industry or anything like that. You don't have any of these constraints. You just do what the hell you want.
Right. So in the final analysis, in your book, Angrynomics, at the end of the book is when you really get down to the meat and potatoes of some of your ideas and things like the National Wealth Fund and the data dividend. These are all things that allow us to sort of leapfrog that debate, aren't they? I mean,
yeah, or at least bypass it, or at least allow these parties and these governments a way of talking about it, right? So a simple example of this, right? Let's say the government spends money building houses, right? Something they used to do. And when you do that, you say, well, you're spending money. And like, you shouldn't be in that business. The private market should do it. Well, the private market doesn't do it. They just build houses for rich people. We know this, right? Okay, when you give them a tax credit, then they might build 5 houses for every 20 they build. It's a total waste of time. Why not just build houses? Well, that'll increase your debts. Oh, well, look, let's think about it. If I build an asset, a house, and that house generates an income called rent, and that rent over time is higher than the cost of building the asset minus depreciation, that's net positive. That's why people invest in real estate. So if the government does that, let's say it spends 10% of GDP building houses, but over a 20-year period, it makes back the cost of the houses and then has an asset that basically generates income ad infinitum. You're actually reducing the debt through investment. So there's this way that we talk about this, that government spending is spending and it's wasteful and it's just wasting stuff. But what about if you're actually using it to invest in things that people need, like housing, like better schools, like healthcare that's actually affordable, right? Wouldn't that be an investment in things? Because if you had healthier workers, then you'd have lower healthcare costs, right? So to me, it's a question of selling this as what it is, which is an investment. Technically, what it means is the net asset position of the state doesn't change. In fact, it gets better because it has assets rather than liabilities. And if it's okay for businesses to think this way, why isn't it okay for the biggest business in the country, which is the government, to actually think that way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So we somehow need to make sure that people have a better understanding of the difference between spending and investment.
Yeah, absolutely. If it works for business, all business schools do is basically teach people how to talk about spending as investment. That's literally what they do, right? Because you're still spending. Yeah. So if it's okay there, why isn't it okay here, right?
Right. So Mark Blyth, I just want to say that I continue to think that Angrynomics is a book that could change things for the better pretty dramatically. It's the things that the ideas you offer could be implemented fast. They're practical, effective. They have real potential to get people to talk with one another again and to think of themselves in as part of the American community here. And I just want to say that I hope that you're getting a good response to it. I know it's been out for 5 years now almost, but
no, is it 5? No, it's only 3.
No, 3. Okay,
yeah, exactly. Making me feel lazy now.
How do you?
But the
feel?
thing is, we launched it in the middle of a pandemic and a racial reawakening. People were kind of like, and the bookstores were closed, right? So it's been a slow burn.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you feel like the response has been good?
Yeah, I mean, it gets reviewed in, good places. People have definitely bought copies of it. It's been, debated. People are aware of its existence. But, at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're just adding a little increment. You're adding a little bit into the conversation. You're hoping that what it does is it catches someone's imagination as it has yours. And then I talk to you. Other people listen to this. They have it read. And then, maybe they don't like what they see in it, but then it makes them think about something else. And, the conversation moves on. That's all we can do. We move in increments, not mountains.
Right. But it sure would be nice to be able to develop a unified field theory.
Yeah, I tend not to try and think that way. Those ambitions tend to go.
Well, Mark Blyth, thank you so much for giving me the time to speak with you, and I hope that people will go out and pick up your book. And as I say again, if they listen to it on Audible, they get the special treat of listening to the two of you discuss it with each other like you're right over the coffee table.
Exactly. An Irishman and a Scotsman. What more can you ask for?
Thanks again, Mark.
All right. Pleasure, Wayne. Talk to you soon.
Take care. My thanks to Mark Blyth for joining us for this special Rediscovering Our Song episode of the Radical Centrist podcast. And my thanks to both he and Eric Lonergan, his co-author, for writing this important book, Angrynomics. If you've not yet read Angrynomics, or even better, listened to it on Audible, I can't possibly recommend it more strongly. There are two compelling reasons for this. It offers a cogent explanation of the problems that we face and the reasons why we are so deeply divided. And two, it offers real and practical ideas for bridging the divides, for creating systemic change that could help us to heal those wounds. In short, after reading Angrynomics, you will feel a sense of hope for the future, a sense that there is a path forward that leads to greater freedom, greater civility, a broader ownership of economic assets that gives all of us a real stake in our future.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try harder. We always feel that there is something sweeter. Ouch! Got to realize that we could do a bit better. Find more solutions and share with each other. They taught me from the Bible. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why.